So as we've already acknowledged, we pause today to reflect on the men who have so deeply impacted our lives in a variety of ways. For some, it might have been their father, or a stepfather, a brother, an uncle, a cousin, or a friend, a member of their church family, someone in their community, a teacher who stepped in and showed them the way. To consider the lessons we learned from them, some good, things we want to emulate, and others not so good, things we want to change or perhaps never do again. And as I reflected over the week on the men who have impacted my life, people like my dad, Mike, my grandfathers, Arnold and David, my stepdad, John, uncles, friends who were like family, church family who have become more than friends, there's a great deal that I've been given to build on for the remainder of my life, to seek to build, to be like, and at times to try to not do. And yet, as I sat this morning thinking of one piece of advice that I could share with all of you, there were a number that came to mind for me. Things like, only nasties hang with nasties, which I believe in the Bible is something along the lines of bad company corrupts good character. So the idea that who we hang out with and associate with often impacts who we will ultimately be. And that was the wisdom of my father. But the one that kept coming to mind for me was this, Vinta. Now, if this makes no sense to you, don't worry, because it's not something widely used outside of the home of Mike Gledall. Vinta is an acronym that stands for Violence is Never the Answer. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, how prevalent was violence in your house, Justin, that your father needed to say this enough that it stuck so deeply into your mind? And friends, that is a good question. There were a lot of fights in the Gledall house growing up. But this acronym had a number of different uses for my dad. A reminder that living in conflict, whether that be physical or verbal, emotional, mental, or spiritual, was never the way that we were to carry on and to live our lives. It was never the right answer. That in family, in life, in the church, it was about being willing to talk through our issues and to find resolution that was the most important. And this is the topic of conversation in our passage this morning that opens the conclusion to Paul's letter to the Philippians. Because before he goes, there's one more thing that he needs to get off of his chest. An issue in the church that he needs to bring to the surface in case he never gets the chance to say it again. Because of how important its resolution would be for those involved and for the church as a whole. One that, while personal in nature, was damaging the collective group as long as it was still ongoing. And this was a dispute or a disagreement between two women in the church, Euodia and Syntyche. And it was leading to division in the body. And the fact that Paul doesn't indicate what was happening in his letter is said to mean that everyone, or perhaps the majority of the people in the church, already knew what was going on. They were aware of the situation in one way or another. Had heard the story from one or the other, had shared what they heard or had heard from someone else, had established what they thought had gone on, and most likely had chosen their side between one or the other. This situation at a point where not only did the people in the church know about it, but Paul, miles and miles away, had heard about what was going on as well. The news of this issue had reached him in prison. And in the midst of what he was dealing with, he felt he needed to address it. Because he knew the impact it was having, but more so the impact that they could have if brought back together. And he knew this because he had worked so closely with them in spreading the good news during his time there. And so, knowing the importance of their role in the church, in the spreading of the gospel and the harmony of the people, he includes this request in his letter. I plead with you, Euodia, and I plead with you, Syntyche, to be of the same mind in the Lord. Now, if you remember back to our sermon from 3 weeks ago, Paul had used those words before in Philippians chapter 2, when he challenged the people to be of the same mind as Jesus. At that time, being of the same mind meant to be united in their purpose, having a shared identity of living and being in the image of Christ. As a collective, to put others first, to offer grace and love instead of judgment and hate to those who were persecuting them outside of the church. But now in this instance, he's not talking about unity, but calling them to live in harmony with one another. Now perhaps you're much smarter than I am, but I was not sure as I set out on this message what the difference between unity and harmony ultimately was. Because outside of the obvious that they're different words, they are technically synonyms of one another. But as I searched for a difference, I found this definition of what they are in comparison to one another that I think speaks to the use here in this chapter compared to Paul's earlier use in chapter 2. And it's that unity emphasizes oneness, a shared identity in being undivided, while harmony highlights the harmonious blending of diverse elements, like different personalities or roles into a cohesive whole. Essentially, unity is the foundational state of being one, and harmony is the beautiful expression of that oneness in relationships and actions. Unity is the whole becoming one, and harmony is all of the individual ones coming together to make up the whole. So if that's the difference between the two and what Paul is calling the people to in this portion of the letter, how do they get there? And I believe as we journey through these 4 short verses we read earlier, we see the progression that's required to make it happen and what it is ultimately built on. And so first, Paul makes the personal appeal to the 2 women who are involved in the dispute, calling them to address the issue among themselves, pleading with them to seek harmony in their lives and in their situation, to be of the same mind. Paul is saying, because you belong to the Lord, act like him. Do what Jesus would do instead of what you have been doing already. Find common ground. Seek peace and understanding. Put your ego aside. Stop trying to win. Think about and acknowledge where you might have been wrong instead of seeking to be proven right. Choose peace over violence. He's saying, don't forget about the issue that's led you there, but be willing to put it aside if needed to find reconciliation, to resolve it in the best way they could in order to continue to move the mission of the church forward. He's asking them to put down their right to be right and to not let the disagreement they were having or had in the past become the thing that continued to divide the church and limit its effectiveness in carrying out its mission moving forward. Paul was asking them, pleading with them, urging them to both agree to put themselves second in order to find harmony in the church. He's doing this because he knows that it will take them to the second part of living in harmony, focusing not on self, but instead on what they had in common. In this case, to consider the importance of the work that they were engaged in, that the mission and the message mattered most. Paul is calling this out in the most public way in order that they might see the importance of the message they were sharing and the ongoing development of the church, to place it over the personal situation that they found themselves in. That it was not the method of sharing that was important. It was not about who shared it or the way that it was shared. That their disagreement and how it was handled was directly leading to division in the church. That it was distracting from the mission of what God was doing. That for their message to reach the people in the most effective and kingdom-building way, they needed to seek to live in harmony with one another. That for the church to function at its highest capability would take some personal action by both of those people involved. But as we read, and as they read it as well, it was clear that for Paul, the responsibility at this point had gone beyond just the two people that were involved. Because he continues by appealing to others in the church as well, encouraging them to step in this situation to help find peace, to help facilitate the process. It could be said that calling them out in this letter was Paul's way of bringing it to the forefront of the church by acknowledging the elephant in the room, teaching each person the importance of being a peacemaker over a pot stirrer when it comes to Christian conflict, challenging everyone who had taken a side to seek the resolution of this matter for the betterment of the kingdom. That he added it to the letter to end the disagreement, but to let everyone know the importance of this issue, of their issues being resolved, of seeking harmony, not spreading gossip, of not choosing sides in a matter, but bringing together the whole. Paul is sharing this call to everyone to live in harmony with everyone else. And at the same time, he doesn't want to leave it in the hands of the group to decide how this should be addressed. There wouldn't be 200 judges or jury members. He doesn't want just anyone to be involved, so he calls on specific leaders of the church, trusted colleagues, to act in his absence. Knowing that while this was a personal issue, it was lived out in public, impacting the church, creating disharmony in the body. So it was important for the church to step forward and to assist in making sure they would find a resolution. That in resolving the issue, they would ultimately be made aware that there was a place for them both in the community, even if it looked different than it did before, should they choose to live within that new reality. That there was acceptance for them. A new reality, not what was, sacrifice needed, change required, but a harmony in the church built not on conflict and a need to be right or for justice, but one built on the concepts Paul would describe in verses 4 and 5. That the first foundational block of living in harmony would be to rejoice, or to find joy in the Lord always. Now, this is something that Paul has mentioned throughout his letter. Rejoice also appearing multiple times in chapter 1 and in chapter 2 as well. But he brings it here as this shift is central to changing the mindset of those involved and all those in the church, while also reinforcing the importance of this mindset to others who are listening at that time. That the focus needs to be on finding joy in all circumstances. Joy not being just happiness, but a deep sense of gladness dependent on who Jesus is, not who we are or what is happening around us. That to live in harmony meant rejoicing in all circumstances because of being in relationship with God, experiencing his goodness, and knowing the surety of his promises. That when viewing the challenges of life through the lens of eternity, of the blessings of God, there is no other response than to find joy, knowing that this life is not the end. So Paul is sharing with them the truth that if they are to take on an attitude of rejoicing in being known by God and finding themselves in his family in this present conflict, they would stop seeking to have their own way, but to embrace his way. They would lay aside their differences. They would seek forgiveness or offer it to someone else. That the only winning would be by letting love wash over all that had happened in order to bring everyone back together. And that could only be done by letting gentleness be evident to all, he concludes. Gentleness being an approach of kindness, of meekness, tenderness in the way they would approach one another. Not returning violence with violence or hate with hate, unforgiveness with unforgiveness, but turning the other cheek as Jesus had advised, praying for those who persecuted them, placing others above themselves, seeking the good of those who would not seek it for them, not laying down, or being walked over, not forgetting and not learning from the situation to protect ourselves in the future. But Paul is saying, be strong enough in the love of Jesus to lay down the right to be right, to justice in order to see God's love spread among the body. Paul, in these 4 short verses, is calling these 2 women and the people to remember that no matter what has happened before, vinta, or perhaps in this case, dinta, disagreement leading to division is never the answer. That to live in harmony means to put aside the personal differences and disagreements and disputes in order for the collective good of the body of Christ to win out. That the parties of the disagreement must come together with the support of the community to find a way forward in order to see joy and gentleness bring back together in God's love what human actions have torn apart. A lesson, let's be honest, as we stand here studying it in 2025, perhaps hits home a little close for us. As we think about divisions in our world, in our country, in our community, within the church as a whole, right here at Oshawa Temple. As we think about situations we find ourselves in or we know others are struggling through because of things in the past, situations of the present or ones of the past that are presently unresolved. That if we stop and reflect on things this morning and where they stand, we could learn a little from Paul about how to seek to live in harmony with one another. That it'll take asking ourselves the difficult questions. Like, is there a disagreement or a discord that has led to division in the body that we personally need to work through in order to bring harmony to what God is doing here at Oshawa Temple? Has our personal situation become the source of discord or division? Led to people choosing sides, creating issues that if they continue to be left unresolved will forever limit the effectiveness of ministry of our church here? Is there a situation in our lives or our church where there is a willingness from those involved to seek resolution? Or do we need to bring leaders of our community into the conversation in order to make sure that we can move forward for the good of all involved, but for the church as a whole? That if in thinking about these questions, we can answer yes to any of those things, that we should choose today to live in harmony, as Paul was challenging the people of Philippi to do in his letter to them. To seek resolution where it's possible, to pray for it when it isn't. To come together to discuss a way forward with the person who we find ourselves in conflict with, or in love to encourage those who are in conflict to find peace with one another. To offer forgiveness and grace as Jesus offered it to those who had hurt him, or to seek it for ourselves as many did when that grace was offered to them during his time, or as we've sought from him in our past. To humbly seek the good of all of those who have been affected. Because, friends, his kingdom was not built on acts of violence, disagreement, or discord. It will not come through digging in our heels to get the win. That for us to be who he's called and created us to be, it will take a shift in our perspective from winning earthly battles, from focusing on earthly circumstances, to finding joy and seeking his heavenly perspective. It will take laying our egos aside in order to be gentle in our approach to one another, no matter what has gone on before. That that's how we live our lives like Jesus. That's how we honor our Father, not just today and every day. That's how we unlock the full potential of his church. That's how we begin to live in harmony with one another.